And there we are, part 3 of A Christmas Carol. I hope you've enjoyed part 1 and part 2, and now we're going to find out what happens next. Well, I can't say that Scrooge was woken up again from his very disturbed slumber by a noise. Rather, it was the absence of a noise, and a cold deeper than any cold you have ever felt. And the darkness around him was darker than any other darkness you might have ever experienced. And he startled himself into awakening and opened his eyes and could see nothing. Managed to fumble his way to the bottom of his bed and opened his curtains for the last time. And there, in the middle of the room, well, he thought it was the room, there was nothing. Just the darkest darkness you have ever experienced. And in the middle of that darkness were the two brightest eyes you have never experienced, or he had ever experienced. Imagine, like two burning sapphires looking straight at him. He was so scared. He said, "Oh, no, I don't need to know anymore. I don't need, please, I've had enough. I've learnt my lesson. I know what I need to. Leave me alone." But out of the absolute darkness, there came the skeletal hand, and the skeletal hand waved his index finger forward. Said nothing, but the meaning was there. And hypnotized, Scrooge got off his bed, wearily put his dressing gown on again, and stepped into the future. Found himself in the street in Camden Town. Do you remember the street in Camden Town where that rather jolly Christmas party took place yesterday, or was it the day before? And he found himself in front of the very same house, but oh, lo, the house looked so sad and neglected. No longer were the window panes sparkling. No longer was the step painted the freshest white. And he had to clean the window with his sleeve to see what was going on, and he saw by the side of a very meagre fire a woman crying. And he could hardly recognize her. Yes, of course, it was Mrs. Scatcherd, but she seemed to be bowed under by the most saddest of despair. And she was talking to herself. "Now, come on, pull yourself together. Pull yourself together. It's going to be fine. You can do this. Come on, pull yourself together. You have some work to be getting on with." And she took a big, deep breath, and then she started going back to her sewing. She was sewing something. And there was and Scrooge turned towards the non-thing that was standing next to him. His presence was felt by the cold oozing from it, and said, "What's happened? What's gone wrong?" And the index finger, I remember it, pointed to the mantelpiece. And Scrooge looked to the mantelpiece, and on the mantelpiece was Tiny Tim's crutch. "Oh, no," said Scrooge. "That's not possible. Surely not." And then there was a knock at the door, and the door opened, and a very changed Bob Cratchit walked in. No longer was he joyfully balancing a little boy on his shoulder. He was bent by grief. But you know, in the way people do, he was trying to be brave. And he smiled at his wife and he said, "My dear, I've just been, and he's really happy there." And she replied in the same false, joyful voice that we use when we try to not make somebody more miserable than they already are. "Oh, is he, my dear? Yes, oh yes. He loves it up at Highgate Village. He can see everything from his tomb. He can see everything. I'm so glad we put all our savings in that." "Oh, that's very good, my dear." And whoosh! The next thing that happened is that Scrooge was transported to the stock exchange, where he felt marginally better, because if there was something he knew, it was a stock exchange. It's in Threadneedle Street in London, very handsome building, and Scrooge was very familiar with it. And even though it was obviously Christmas Day, there were people there having a drink, talking to their friends, ambling about, and he looked at the corner where he usually had his desk, and there was no desk there, which puzzled him somewhat. And then he saw two people he knew. One of them was as long and thin as a leek, and the other one was as round as a pea. They were not green, but I just want you to imagine there was the pea and the leek, and they were talking to each other. And the pea was saying to the leek, "Oh, have you heard the latest? My, he's finally gone after all these years of miserable and parsimony. Apparently he died in his sleep, which I don't think is fair." The leek answered, "No, it isn't. I don't think it is at all. He was such a horrible man. I bet there's a lot of people dancing in the streets of London today. This whole miser is finally dead, and all these debtors have been released, I hope and trust." And the pea was saying, "Are you going to go to the funeral?" And the leek said, "Oh, I don't think so." "Well, I would, unless there was something interesting happening, but I bet you there's only going to be 1 or 2 mourners there, if that." "Oh, yes," said the pea, "I don't think I'll bother. I would only be interested if there was a nice meal afterwards." And he touched his very taunt paunch. And the leek said, "Oh, yes, I quite agree with you." And they walked off. And Scrooge went to reach out for them, but of course they couldn't see him. And he was like, "I wonder who this person is that's dead." And they're quite nice people, really. They're very charitable. Why are they talking about him in that horrible way? But then he was transported to another place in the East End of London, in the really poorest part of the East End of London, where all the slums were, where people, a whole family would live in a room. And the place stank. It was horrible. And he was taken up by that dreadful phantom upstairs, rickety stairs, to a room where there was a woman, not an old woman, a young woman, desolate, with a baby in her arms. And the baby was obviously hungry, but the woman couldn't be bothered to try to feed it. And then there was again the step on the stairs, and she looked up, and the door was slammed against the wall, and a man walked in, a young man. "My dear, you'll never believe it." He sounded quite posh, really, for such a place. "You'll never believe it. He's dead. Hurrah, he's dead." And she said, "Who's dead?" "He's dead. The man is dead. The man who holds the book, the man who holds our debts is dead. And the book has been torn to shreds. We don't owe anyone anything." "Oh, this is amazing. We can start again. We can start again," said the young man. And he said, "I'm not usually like this, but I am so glad. He's tortured us for so many years. And now we don't owe anything. We can start afresh. All will be well, my dear. All will be well." And now Scrooge started to think, this all sounds slightly familiar. He didn't remember the young man. He had so many people to make miserable with his ways. So many people in that book of his that contained all the knowledge and all the blackmail you could imagine. He could torture so many people. And his heart was laden to see how somebody would rejoice if someone died like that. And then he didn't have much time left, because he was taken to another place, still in the East End of London. Oh, if it's humanly possible, it was even more horrible. Its owner would have called it a shop, would call it a cave. It was full of rubbish. The rubbish that desperate people try to sell when they have nothing left to sell. And behind the desk, there was a man, and he looked like a big spider. Horrible, flaccid. And on the other side of the desk, there was a woman, and Scrooge thought, "That's very strange. She looks like my housekeeper." I mean, housekeeper is a very loose word, as I might have mentioned beforehand. There's the woman that did for him. Not very much, actually. And in her hands, I think her name was Mrs. Gimble. In her hands, there were curtains. Scrooge thought, "That's very funny. I seem to recall those curtains. They look like my bed curtains." And the spider was saying to Mrs. Gimble, "Well, you've done quite well there, my dear. You have done quite well. And what else have you got?" And out of another bag, she got Scrooge's best suit out, which wasn't much to say, I have to say, but never mind. And then Scrooge realised, and he said, "Oh, no, it's me, isn't it? They've even robbed me on my deathbed." And then he was taken again to Highgate Cemetery, and there was a stone. And on the stone it said, "Ebenezer Scrooge died 25th of December, 18..." And you could see the letters 1, 8, 5. No. And as the letter 4 started to form itself, Scrooge screamed, "Not yet! I haven't had time to make amends. Please, you can take me when you want, but not now. I need to make amends, please." And he fought for all his might and woke up to find himself tangled in his sheets. Nearly strangled he was. Opened the curtains as soon as he could get himself free, and there was the most beautiful of days. The sun was shining, it snowed overnight. And he opened his window, and there was a boy who recoiled in horror because he knew Mr. Scrooge did not like boys usually. "Come on, boys, don't be frightened of me, boy, you excellent boy," said Scrooge. "What day is it?" And the boy looked very puzzled and said, "Well, Mr. Scrooge, it's Christmas Day." "Wonderful, boy. If I send you some money down, I'll put it in a handkerchief. Would you go and get the butcher? Because I need him to bring his best goose to an address I will give him." "Well, of course, sir, I will." And the boy went off and found the butcher, and the butcher came back carrying this enormous goose on the sledge, because that's the only way he could carry it. And the boy got some money to say, "Well done for you, boy," and was waved off by this lovely old man that Scrooge had become. Very strange it was all. And the butcher was given the address of the house in Camden Town. "Well, you'll never believe it. Mrs. Crimple, you'll never believe it," says Mrs. Cratchit. "What happened? Well, some person who thought they were a benefactor sent us the biggest goose you've ever seen. They had to drag it along the street on a sledge. And what was I supposed to do with this enormous goose, I ask you? What was I supposed to do? I'm telling you, I had to go and beg the baker to empty his oven so that he could put it in, and I had to negotiate with all the neighbours, thank God. We all shared it. But seriously, I have a very good idea as to who it was that gave us that goose. And he did learn eventually what was useful and what wasn't. And I'm not being an ungrateful wretch, but seriously, what was he thinking about?" And having done that, Mr. Scrooge got himself washed. He even went and got himself shaved, can you believe it? And dressed properly in his best finery, which wasn't much, but he did his best. And this time, he arrived at the house in Bloomsbury. And at the very door, that Topper and Toppers and the sister, Rosie's sister, do you remember her, were standing there, and there was Scrooge behind. And he was greeted with a screech of delights. Fred was thrilled to bits. Rose, not so much. She was a bit worried that Scrooge was going to be miserable all day, but he wasn't. He danced and he played and he ate like there was no tomorrow, and he brought lots of presents, and he even had a quiet word with Topper. He did. So it seemed that Topper, at the end of the day, had a definite arrangement with the sister. And then he went home. And he was never the same man again. And that very night he burnt his book. Do you remember the little notebook that he had all the names and the dates in? He burnt it. And let it be known that he was closing shop. And then the next morning, when Bob Cratchit arrived, there was a roaring fire in the chimney, and he couldn't believe it. It's like, "Oh my God, what's going on?" And Scrooge told him that from now on, he was never going to be a moneylender again. He would dedicate the rest of his life to good works, and he wanted Bob to be his secretary, and he was doubling his salary. And that is what happened during the last act of A Christmas Carol. What? What? What are you saying? Oh, yes, of course. I'm so sorry. What happened to Tiny Tim? Well, Tiny Tim became best friends with Scrooge. And Tiny Tim grew to be a very tall and handsome man. He became a carpenter, in fact. And he would still, on Christmas Day, annoy his mother and say to the assembled company, "God bless us, everyone," in that very annoying childlike voice that he used to have when he was a child. So this is the end, the absolute end of the story of A Christmas Carol. And what's that about? It's about redemption. It's about hope. And this year, redemption and hope are fairly thin on the ground. Don't give up. Look at what happened to Scrooge. He nearly did. And then it turned out okay in the end. So remember to be kind. Remember to do the best you can. Remember to think also that everyone is also trying to do the best they can. Farewell, and I'll see you around sometime. Bye.